Hello and welcome to the Overlanding podcast, a podcast dedicated to vehicle-dependent travel. I'm your host Andy Smith, and throughout the series I'll be chatting with adventurous people who have chosen to travel the world by bicycle, motorcycle, car and truck. The aim of the podcast is to discover what motivates people to embark on life-changing journeys and to hear some incredible stories along the way. The Overlanding podcast is now available on iTunes, where you can subscribe to get the latest episode direct to your device. If you're not an iTunes user, you can also listen to the show on Stitcher. You can download the free app today from your app store. Whichever platform you use, please do rate and review our show, as this helps to boost it up the listings. Alternatively, you can listen directly on our website at theoverlandingpodcast.com. The podcast has been a sharp learning curve for us, and we are slowly getting to grips with the best way to record and edit Skype conversations. So please bear with us as we find our feet and learn how to do things properly. Hopefully over the coming weeks the quality of the sound recordings will improve. In this episode I chat to fellow Channel Islander David Priddis about his love of short motorcycle trips and his 4-year overland trip around the world in 2 separate Land Rover Defenders. David and I discussed the merits of being a solo traveller, choosing the right gear for your trip, broken clutches and being hunted down by armed border guards in Africa. Okay, we are recording. So, how we start these things is always the same. I don't know if you've listened to any, but traditionally we always ask the same question right at the beginning, which kind of sets the scene. So if you could just answer me this before we dive into our conversation. Out of these 5 locations, where would you prefer this interview to take place? A, near a babbling brook in a lush green valley. B, in a little tent on a windy mountain top. C, on a warm beach with the sea lapping at your feet. D, round a nighttime campfire in a forest. Or E, deep in a tropical jungle.
I have to be on the beach with water lapping at my feet.
Ah, nice. You're the first person to choose that one, actually.
So, it comes from growing up on an island and used to beaches.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's just take a second just to listen to the sea. Nice. So, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, well, I'm David Priddis. I've done a 4-year round the world, 146,000 mile overland adventure. And I can't say it's the only adventurous things I do. I get up to kayaking and diving and motorbike trips and all sorts. So, yeah, I very much live the life of adventure and get out as much as possible.
Okay. And I believe you've also just returned from a motorbike trip, right?
Indeed, yeah. Just been down to the Pyrenees. Took part in a mini Mondo, which is hosted by Austin Vince. And it's... Well, the idea is to get people out and try to experience what adventure motorcycling is like. So it's 3 nights rough camping with trail riding in between. A quick stop at a supermarket to pick up some supplies, but then we're cooking on an open fire, etc. Right in the evening. So keeping it as real as possible.
Yeah. And is that the first time you've travelled in that way on a motorbike, or...?
No, that's my 4th major trip, actually, on that particular bike, actually, the KTM. And so, no stranger to it. It's just that for a combination of reasons. 1, get to ride and meet Austin Vince. 2, he'd put a lot of effort into selecting and joining up the trails in the Pyrenees, which is something I've wanted to do for years but never got around to organising myself. Plus 3, just... typical excuse to get out there and do it and have fun and explore a whole new area and meet a lot of like-minded people. So
yeah, just for any of our listeners who don't know, Austin Vince is one of the co-founders of the Adventure Travel Film Festival, if I've got the name of that correct. He's a really nice guy. Was Austin decked out in his overalls covered in patches?
Not in patches, but he had his atypical stripes down, one side.
Yeah.
And he had his, so I learned, he had his riding overalls, and he also had his evening wear overalls as well for dinner.
Excellent, good stuff. So you're no stranger to motorbike trips and car trips then. How do you find they differ? Just because I think as a biker, you have more kind of a contact with the ground. You're out there in the elements, so there's no hiding inside the safety of a car.
I was actually thinking on the ride back just how the meet and greet experience a lot of the time when you're overlanding goes, and a lot of motorcyclists always claim that you're much more approachable. You're on a bike; they can see you as a person. You're not hiding in that four-wheel drive. And it's like I'm sitting there going, I'm covered in armour from head to toe and look like a stormtrooper. Yeah. It's like, I don't think myself as very approachable right now.
Yeah.
But, yeah. The major elements are you are exposed to the weather, for sure. So you have to put up with the good and bad, whether it be extremely hot or extremely rainy. You therefore have to... A lot of your luggage capacity actually goes into carrying clothing and equipment and armour to enable you to safely ride on a bike and deal with those conditions. Whereas, of course, in a vehicle, well, you take what you normally wear at home in those conditions, just T-shirts, boardies and flip-flops if you're going somewhere hot, or, your warm puffer jacket and a beanie if you're going to cold conditions. Whereas you have to carry some of that so that when you're walking around checking the sights out, you can look normal. And then the vast majority of your actual clothing and gear is motorcycle related. So that takes up a big part of your luggage capacity. Then there's tools, spares, inner tubes for the motorbike. And you're actually left with a very meagre space in your luggage for a nicety or a laptop or a nice camera or something like that. It's really quite surprising how light you have to travel once you have the essentials.
What's the longest motorbike trip you've been on? Because I know certainly in your car you were, 4 years maybe, right?
Oh yeah, I've only ever done a couple of week trips really on the bike.
And on those trips, like the one thing I find incredible, especially when we meet bikers who are undertaking massive trips, like a year plus, is how the levels of fitness and fatigue and hygiene. Which I find quite interesting, because you were just saying then that by the time you've packed your essential kit, there's no room for luxuries, and by that essential kit does mean literally like 2 T-shirts, right? Or like the one you're wearing and another one packed if you're lucky.
Exactly. Yeah. It was along those lines.
So for bikers who are doing long trips, I'm just absolutely astounded, and I think it's far more commendable than taking a car on an equivalent distance.
They definitely do it tougher. Yeah, it's like I had a 9-hour and a 6-hour ride back from the Pyrenees, and just sitting on the bike for that long, you're constantly having to wiggle around and unnumb your bum and stretch your legs out, and then you're stopping every couple of 100 miles for fuel, which is you're thankful for by then because your hands have gone numb or something else, or you're freezing cold, so you need a hot chocolate to warm up or something like that.
Yeah.
No, bikers definitely do it tougher than your general, four-wheel drive overlander for sure. Also, when you're travelling off-road, it is far more physically demanding as well, because you are an integral part of the guidance system of that bike, and you've got to move your body weight around, backwards, forwards, throw it into the corner, pitch the bike in at the right angle, hold the stress of the spinning wheel at the back as you drive around. It's far more exhausting.
Yeah. Like, and the reason I'm asking some of these questions is some of it will be really obvious to some listeners. Obviously, we may have some listeners who've undertaken big motorbike trips, but a lot of our listeners, I think, will probably be people who are thinking about embarking on a trip. And one of the questions we always get asked as an overlander is, what is the perfect vehicle? And I think there are pros and cons to, 4 wheels over 2 wheels, 2 wheels over 4, 6 over 4 if you've got the budget, or even 8 if you've got a really big budget. But I think it's interesting to ask you purely because you've seen both sides of the story, both sides of the coin almost. You've ridden motorbikes and you've been on extended car trips. So I think for people who are possibly thinking about embarking on a trip and don't actually know, because like before we left, I was keen to do a cycling trip, But having spoken to quite a few cyclists, I'm quite glad I didn't now.
Actually, I'm thinking about doing that as well, doing a couple of week tour on a bicycle and see the differences. But,
yeah.
yeah.
I think certainly weeks and possibly even just into months on a bicycle or a motorbike, I reckon I could handle. But anything of a longer duration, I think I would really struggle. And then I think it would slowly grind me down and take the enjoyment out of it. But then again, I think if you're on a motorbike, you're getting your enjoyment from different things that you would in a car. For example, I think for a lot of cyclists and motorcyclists, I think a lot of the enjoyment comes from the physical riding, rather than going to the touristy places and seeing the sights and locations. You know, a good hard day on an interesting trail is probably more enjoyable than going to look around a market or, you know, going to a tourist location. So I think people have different intentions when they set off on trips about, you know, what they're going to get back from their particular means of transport. So I think that's quite interesting. So like you said, the shorter trips you've been on your motorbike have probably been more focused about riding motorbikes than the actual destination or the tourist kind of element of those trips. Is that correct?
Yeah, for sure. The riding element is definitely a big part of the complete deal. And especially where we went in the Mini Mondo, it was about riding those trails. Because they are difficult and, you know, require concentration and stuff. It was about the actual physicals of riding that and the experience of it versus, I think, the one 14th century church we happened to have 10 minutes to have a quick look around.
Yeah. And right at the very beginning of the when we started chatting, you mentioned you were from a small island. Just to give our listeners a bit of context, last week's podcast that we posted was also from another Channel Islander, a guy called Jack Crisp, who had been cycling through the Americas. And I'm obviously from the Channel Islands. I'm from Guernsey in the Channel Islands. You are from Jersey in the Channel Islands. Do you think there is something in the mindset of kind of growing up and living on an island that's kind of, I don't know, flicked a switch in you that basically means you want to go out and see the world and adventure?
I think it made certain possibilities easier because there's a lot of things on your doorstep. Obviously water sports related, but also things like rock climbing. Pretty much you can do anything here that doesn't relate to snow and mountains. Every other sport is virtually catered for.
Yeah.
So because you're in such a small environment and it's easy to get into things like air cadets, which I was involved in, you got to try a lot of these things for free or next to no money. And that actually, through air cadets, got me heavily into kayaking, which I've taken from strength to strength over the years. And, you know, I've dabbled in sailing, I dive a fair bit. So it gives you this outdoorsy pursuit type mindset. But just because it's there and available doesn't mean a lot of people actually, you know, grab those opportunities and make the most of them. There is plenty in my immediate friends circle who are more than happy with the 2.4 children, 9 to 5 work, you know, doing their favourite sport once or twice a week and just happily living life. They don't have any grand desire to disappear off over the horizon and explore the world.
Yeah. But do you think, one thing I found quite interesting though is living on a small island, certainly especially in Guernsey where the population, I think in Jersey you have slightly more open land and open areas, but certainly in Guernsey the population is quite large and the island is obviously quite small. It's very difficult to find places with wide open space where you literally can't see another house. And it can be incredibly claustrophobic being surrounded by water. Do you think that has influenced your sense of adventure to basically escape the confines? Because for me, certainly growing up in the Channel Islands, there have been times where it literally felt like a prison because you're just surrounded by water. And that sense of adventure is quite restrictive. Like when I was growing up, there was literally nowhere I hadn't been on the island. Like I knew every corner of that island just to, to go out and discover it. So did you have that same kind of sense of imprisonment growing up on the island, or?
No, actually, funny enough, one of my ex-girlfriends said the very same thing. She called it her little prison after a couple of years here.
Yeah.
But personally, I've never felt that, because I always see the sea as a freedom, an escape, just another mode of transport.
Yeah.
So I can look at the ocean surrounding me 360, and I don't see it as a barrier. I see it as an extension of a playground.
Cool. So okay, well let's talk about your car trip then. So what kind of vehicle do you drive?
Land Rover Defender 110.
Yeah. Just to let our listeners know, where did you go in it?
The first trip, I took it down Africa, down the west coast and up through central and east.
Yeah.
Then there was a break to restock the travel tokens. Then I took it up through Northern Europe to Finland, across Western Russia, through Kazakhstan, through Eastern Russia, then down through Mongolia, China to Southeast Asia. Then I shipped from Port Klang in near Kuala Lumpur, across to Los Angeles in North America. Then drove right up north to Alaska and Prudhoe Bay, and then mostly down the Pacific side, all through Central America, shipped round from Panama to Cartagena, and then generally kept along the Pacific side as well, down to Ushuaia, and then came back up along the Atlantic to Uruguay, and then shipped to Australia. Then spent a couple of years there living and working, done a lap of Australia, then shipped it to India, and then drove back along the southern Asian route through Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, Greece, that way into Europe, and back to little old Jersey.
Excellent. So that is pretty much an epic trip. That's there's very few places you haven't been. How many countries is that in total?
94.
94.
Yeah. And I just clocked up on 95 because I went through Andorra on the way back.
Yeah, the tiniest of places.
Exactly.
Yeah. But very beautiful. It's an incredibly beautiful place, Andorra.
Mountain passes on the way in and out. It's brilliant.
So that trip, over how many years? You said you took a couple of years out in Australia working. I presume that's just to restock the funds again and before you head off, or?
It was partly that, and also it was always a life goal of mine, being Australian born and an Australian passport holder. I always planned to spend some time there because the place is so vast. You could spend the next 20 years flying in and out and checking out different bits. But I found it easier to actually live there for a while and work. And the job I chose actually involved a lot of travel around the country. So that helped explore it on a more day-to-day level before actually doing a big 6-month lap in the Land Rover. So. Yeah.
And how did you find importing the car? Because I know a lot of people have trouble importing vehicles into Australia because the rules and regulations. Any issues with cleaning your vehicle before taking it to Australia?
Well, I spent 2 weeks thoroughly cleaning the vehicle in Argentina before I actually moved on to Uruguay and put it in the container.
Yeah.
So I didn't actually have any problems. I passed the inspection when I arrived. But there was some other paperwork hurdles which are difficult, time-consuming, and some aspects expensive to get through and actually get the car imported properly there.
So your trip in total, how many years were you actually on the road?
It was 4 years continuously on the road, spread over a period of about 10 years.
Yeah. And during that time you're sleeping in the vehicle or in a tent or?
Mixture. In Africa I had a roof tent, but I also had the capability to sleep in the Land Rover then. And I've kept that ability. I think it's a good plan B if the weather's really foul or if you end up stopped somewhere that's not very safe or friendly. And then generally I would have ground tents that I could just throw out. I had a range of ground tents for different conditions, from tropical warm to freezing cold and wet. So
yeah. And through that time, were you travelling on your own or people joining you for various stretches? Did you pick up hitchhikers, or were you predominantly on your own for most of that kind of journey?
Generally speaking, I travel on my own, but meet a lot of people along the way.
Yeah.
Then I have picked up some hitchhikers in the past, but I didn't find the encounters or the experiences generally very positive. So I refined that to more giving fellow backpackers that I'd happened to meet in hostels or stuff. So I had time to sort of suss them out and character and this, that, and the other, rather than just the very random, you don't know what you're picking up from the roadside sometimes, with a hitchhiker.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've been hanging out with them a couple of days and you're obviously there for a reason to sightsee what's in the local area, and you get to go out for dinner and experience a few things, then you know whether you get on or not. And then if they're going in the same direction, then often I would invite them and say, well, I'm going this way, you're going this way, you're welcome to jump in for a few days, and I drop you off at the next town or site that you want to stay at. And so had some travelling companions that way. And then also I've had friends specifically fly in for a couple of weeks. And, I had an Australian friend for 2 weeks in India, had a Mexican friend for 2 weeks in Iran, and then a sort of a friend of a friend, an American guy that happened to be in Turkey anyway. But his girlfriend went back early, so then we met up and then we travelled together for a few weeks. So, yeah, those sort of encounters have generally worked out well.
Yeah. And how do you find not the dynamic, but how do you find the difference between travelling with someone in the vehicle and travelling on your own? Did after 2 weeks with your mate from Australia, were you struggling to have another person in the car, or did you enjoy the company?
I enjoyed the company. It's sometimes fun actually to be able to witness the other person's reaction, because inevitably they come straight from a first world country half the time.
Yeah. And
so things are more in their face, with the culture shock.
You've acclimatised to it and the method of travel and everything. So yeah.
Exactly. So it's kind of nice to be refreshed in that excitement and that wonder by having someone else that much more new to the scenario. That can be enjoyable, and then also just sharing experiences, but it does have one or two downsides as well. I find that when I'm travelling with someone else, especially someone who speaks good English, you tend to become a little bit more insular as a group, because you go out to dinner and, of course, you chat amongst yourselves. And whereas if I'd go out for dinner on my own in a town or city, then people would be more likely to approach me, especially if I'm the only white guy in a little local joint in a back street somewhere. And also me talking to the locals more as well, you make more effort. Yeah. And so it does change the experience, having friends or other Western travellers along versus just being there on your own.
Yeah. I certainly see the benefits of travelling on your own, where you are literally thrown into situations where, you're forced to deal with it, basically. And as far as like travelling in a vehicle, did you encounter any problems, like mechanically, where being on your own was problematic, or recovery? Basically, if your vehicle gets stuck, if there's someone else there, it lightens the load, and it also helps. Someone can guard the car or watch the car where you go off to get parts or whatever else. So, were you ever in a situation where you found it difficult being on your own with the vehicle in those kind of problematic times?
The only one I'd think about would be when I broke the clutch in Bolivia, because I was on my own, I had to leave the vehicle in the middle of nowhere, and obviously unguarded, unprotected. So there was always the potential for someone else to find it and smash a window and rob stuff, because it certainly wasn't going anywhere.
Yeah.
In most of the other situations, when I'm doing recoveries or repairs, a lot of the time just being on your own, I found less stressful than actually having someone with me. Because having someone with you, especially like a mate or something like that, with all good intentions, they want to help out and they want to get involved, but half the time it's a new situation and they don't know what they're doing. So you end up having to think for both of you. So you're telling them what to do and what they need to dig there or go run this line over there and things like that. But then you still have to go back and check that they've done it right or done the shackle up properly, or because you are going to load it up with a couple of ton. You can't just not go look at it, and if things go wrong, they can go very wrong. So, and so in a way, you end up having to do like double the work. Whereas if you were just doing it on your own and you take your time because you're stuck, you're not going anywhere, you just plow through it. You know that you've done this right. You know you've tried X. You know you've tried Y. You know you've done that shackle up. You know how you've constructed the anchor and what to watch out for. So in some instances, actually, the recoveries are more stressful when you've got multiple people to organise and keep an eye on and check that they're putting things in the right way, or using the high lift jack safely, or putting the sand tracks at the right angles under the wheels, or all this business. I actually find it more complex than with
more people,
more than one person. Yeah.
So were there also times when you travelled with other people in other vehicles?
Yes, for sure. Yeah. Even on my very first trip down Africa, I got to a town in Mauritania, and we very quickly found other overlanders in this campsite, and we formed a group to cross what was an open Sahara, just guided by GPS waypoints.
Yeah.
Sadly, now it's a tarmac road, from what I understand.
Yeah.
But because of the remoteness and the unusual nature of the route, we teamed up, and I actually ended up travelling with that Dutch couple in another Land Rover for about 6 weeks through Western Africa before, our paths finally took us different ways. So
yeah. And how did you find the Land Rover as a choice of vehicle? Did you like before you mentioned that the clutch went? Did you have trouble finding parts, or was it relatively easy to source parts for it?
In Bolivia, it's hard to find parts for it. They're not particularly popular there, and also the vast majority of vehicles operating out of Uni, which is the town I ended up getting towed to with Toyotas.
Yeah.
So it was a bit of a bad place to break down in the first place. The clutch simply broke because I was abusing it, to be fair. I was just asking too much of it.
Yeah.
So in hindsight, I should have been nicer, or actually gauged the river crossing better in my rights. Would have really helped a great deal.
It didn't go in the middle of the river, did it?
I did, yes. It was stuck axle deep in mud, and that's when it broke.
Okay. So how, in that particular instance, did you get some? How did you recover the vehicle, or did you leave the vehicle exactly where it was?
Well, I had to leave the vehicle where it was, gather up a few essential supplies, and then walk 10 kilometres looking for a friendly farmer with a big tractor.
Yeah.
And then explain in my Spanglish what the idiot gringo had done round the corner, and get a ride back in the tractor and get them to pull me out the river.
Yeah.
And then subsequently, once they'd seen the vehicle was disabled, then convinced them that it was a good idea for them to help tow me to the nearest town, which was, I think, 117 kilometres away.
Wow, that's really quite far.
Yeah, especially at tractor speed, somewhat 14 hours or something.
Okay. And anywhere else in the world, what other problems did you encounter mechanically? And did you find that, again, being on your own as a solo traveller, that, if the car breaks, you just get on and deal with it at your own speed and no pressure from anyone else to repair it? Is that typically the way?
Yeah, well, at least when travelling with a car, because generally speaking, you've got food and water on board. So even if you're stuck out in the middle of nowhere, there's no immediate danger to you. You've got shelter, you've got food, you've got water. So if you eke those supplies out, generally speaking, you could comfortably live for a week without much problem. So that takes out the immediacy of any breakdown. Then it boils down to whether you have the right parts, of course, or whether you can bodge something together to limp forward to get to somewhere where you can either ship in the right parts or things like that. Because I'm fairly mechanically aware, and I do daily checks and stuff, I had very few big breakdowns. Like the clutch was the biggest of the thing, and that took a week. after I got towed to uni, to drop the whole lot out, find parts, run around town, put it all back together, and be on my way. All the other ones, I had warning signs just from doing daily maintenance and checks, or listening to noises and then checking stuff out later when you're in the comfort of a nice campsite with a shower and that. And so most things weren't a huge surprise. Like one day I spotted the water pump had started to leak. So just keeping an eye on then the fluid over the next couple of days. I waited till I rolled past the Land Rover garage in Australia, bought a new one off the shelf, and then waited, I think, another 2 weeks until I'd stopped at a friend's place where I could then rip it all out on the driveway and actually change it.
Yeah, certainly that kind of mechanical awareness helps. Generally, I normally crawl under the car like every other day and just give it a bit of a look through, just to see if there's anything obvious. And again, like you say, you're travelling with the vehicle so much and you get to know that vehicle inside and out. And so any slight variation in, steering wheel wobble or like, vibration or slight change in noise from anything, you really become hyper aware of it. And they're normally warning signs that something is changing. So yeah, typically you can catch that stuff quite early. Okay, cool. So that major trip, before you set off on that major trip, kind of where were you in life and why did you want to embark on that major trip?
The Africa leg, if you search, was always meant to just be an Africa trip. And when I was originally, I was at university and I was finishing my degree, and like all students, you want to go travelling. And it was just that a couple of the books I was reading at the time were focused about history and elements in Africa. And I thought, well, if I'm going to take a gap year out, I don't just want to do the typical Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand type thing. Because in my mind, it doesn't take a great deal of nous or preparation. You just buy a Lonely Planet and book an air ticket and go. It's a well-trodden route.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, let's do something more challenging that I might not be able to do at another point in my life when I have more commitments of perhaps wife, children, house, those sort of things. And so I kept leaning towards this Africa idea. And then initially I was just going to backpack it. And I was putting together a map of, just literally marking X's on a map of the places I wanted to visit, and then working out how I'd get there, and what's the local transport like, and what's the safety like in these places. And then my risk assessment of it, I was most likely to get either seriously hurt or die in the public transport, in the rickety chicken bus with an unlicensed driver on crap roads, driven too fast. And I thought, well, that's actually going to be the majority of my risk traveling around this continent, and it is a continent. It's not like I'm just doing it for 5 minutes or a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, how can I reduce that risk? And then I thought, well, I need control over my transport. And things like bicycle and stuff just got thrown out the window quite quickly because of the vastness of the deserts and all those sort of businesses, and the ability to get away from trouble quickly and things like that. So then I was either left with motorcycle or four-wheel drive, because trucks are clearly out of the budget. And then just because of the remoteness and the routes I wanted to do, I went with the four-wheel drive because I needed the longer fuel range and the water carrying ability and that ability to off-road. And so then that set my mind of, okay, well, I'd like to take a four-wheel drive, but does anybody do this, and how far do they go? And then that actually started me on the whole overland track. And the more I researched it, the more I found there was plenty of people out there doing it, namely the Dutch and the Germans, with the odd Frenchy thrown in, especially for North Africa. And then you found other resources like Chris Scott's. He had a Sahara page specifically, and at the time he'd released his book Sahara Overland, which detailed a lot of cool back routes as well as practical advice on vehicle selection and kit and what you should take. And so, the trip turned into an overland trip. And so I bought a rickety old Land Rover, spent a couple of years rebuilding it, kitting it out, and then set off. And then in the process of travelling like that with the vehicle, I found I really fell in love with that style of travel, actually going from border to border in the country and not just flying in and seeing the tourist sites or a spot area or going to just one wilderness area. You often got to experience the country from literally coast to coast or through the mountains and through the deserts, and you met the farmers as well as the city slickers, and you got a far better feel for the country that way, and an understanding of its geography and its people and its cultures, because evidently you're living on four wheels. You go to the markets, you talk to the locals to get fuel, you explore the sites, you eat the local food. You're just far more ingrained and involved in the day-to-day running of that country than if you just flew in and hiked a certain mountain and then flew out of it.
Yeah. So how long that first trip, was that the same Land Rover you have now then? Or is that a different Landy?
I took a TDI 200 to Africa, which was quite long in the tooth when I rebuilt it. And then the short answer is when I came back, I didn't feel it was worth reinvesting in that vehicle for then I was then hatching a plan to do multiple longer trips.
Yeah.
I didn't even then quite decide that I was actually going to drive completely around the world. I was just thinking of the next segment, if you like.
Yeah.
But I then wanted to be able to do a segment, but then still have a vehicle capable of doing another segment later.
Yeah. So, and that Africa trip, how long? What was the duration of that?
That was 1 year. 1 year on the road.
Okay. So when you came back, had that completely kind of revolutionised your kind of outlook on life and how you wanted to travel, and then were you just completely addicted?
I was addicted to travel before that and done plenty of other adventurous trips, but I then really fell in love with the overlanding style of travel, for sure.
Yeah. And then from that point, how long between trips?
Well, because I bought a new Land Rover, which is the one I have now in 2006, of course I had to pay it off. Then in the process of paying it off, there was the 3 years it was in guarantee, and it wasn't until it went out of guarantee that I started heavily modifying it. So really, the last 2 years of that 5-year period was when I was modifying it and kitting it up, and then really just deciding where I was going to take it next. So.
And then your choice for a Land Rover, it was, what particular reason did you choose a Land Rover?
There's a few different reasons. One of the main things is that because they're built in Britain or were built in Britain, and because of the landing culture there, you could buy anything and anything for them. It's just, for instance, if I was to start off in Australia, a Land Rover probably wouldn't be my choice because they're more expensive because they're imported. Plus, you can't get as many parts of them out there as you can in the UK. And so you're better off, say, outfitting a Toyota or a Nissan Patrol in Australia. But you can't buy those vehicles cheaply and readily available here in the UK, or the right types of Toyotas and Nissan Patrols. You get the super slick, air-conditioned, computer-riddled engine types. Whereas, you want a good 76 series or something like that, with a good solid lump that just keeps turning. And those that are in the UK or wider Europe command an overinflated price because of their rarity. Not only do you pay more for the base vehicle, but then because Britain is Land Rover mad, to buy stuff to, say, put a suspension lift on a Toyota or get a winch bumper for it or long-range fuel tanks costs more because it's either specialty stuff or it's having to be imported in from the likes of South Africa or Australia anyway.
So your Defender, because I've got a soft spot for Defenders. I certainly think they look the part, and there's always a lot of campsite chatter about people's vehicles, and there's a lot of joking that goes on as to what particular vehicle choice people have, and I certainly know Land Rovers do get a tough time Land Rover owners get a tough time certainly from Toyota owners, and vice versa. I always find it quite amusing just to sit around the campfire.
Chipping into the banter as well, but I like to keep it tongue in cheek. I don't like to get too serious over it.
Although some people do, which is pretty funny. We were spending that much time with the vehicle. Did you think you made the right choice then for your trip?
Yeah, it's a solid four-wheel drive at the end of the day. It's fairly basic mechanically. The computer-controlled engine, even though I have a TD5, didn't give me a whole lot of grief regards its computers and sensors and this, that and the other. But then I do have an electronics background, so that stuff doesn't really scare me. I just work my way through it like any other toolbox. The engine was really solid, kept turning. As I said, other than your typical Land Rover inherent oil leaks, which come free with the vehicle. You don't have to pay extra for those, by the way. There was no real major problems with it. Things just wore out through wear and tear. I changed a couple of half shafts, done the usual things like the odd bearing here and there, seals, hub seals, stuff like that. Nothing that I don't think any four-wheel drive, regardless of manufacturer, wouldn't suffer from after driving it around the world off-road.
Yeah, those are typical things like seals, bearings, minor problems like that. They're not even problems. It's wear and tear, isn't it? It's
Exactly. So you carry those sort of spares, and often those little rubber seals or gaskets, they're some of the cheapest bits.
Yeah.
And so you just buy a few, chuck them in a box, and it relieves a whole level of stress and pain going to find the bits in the middle of some foreign land.
But also sometimes some of the most annoying little pieces of rubber.
Can be the most difficult to track down.
And to change.
Yes,
Okay, so from there, from the Africa trip, did it change your, did you have any major profound changes in your life? Did it change your outlook on life, or had you travelled enough previously that it was kind of, it's more travelling, but this is my new way of travelling now for sure. That's what you enjoy. And had you done the motorbike trips before or after that Africa trip? What came first?
They've been interspersed really. I've been on bike trips before I went to Africa, and then I've done some since. I've definitely done some of the more adventurous ones regarding where I've taken the bike since. Whereas the bike trips before maybe a little bit more sedate, around Europe, things like this, or just into little off-road areas or mountainous regions, not fully off, into the back and beyond of Morocco. It's always difficult to see yourself, how you grow and change on a trip, because it happens daily. It's like, you don't notice your hair growing, do you? Because you're there, looking in the mirror every day. It sneaks up on you, and it's not until sometimes people ask your opinion on it and you rattle off a reply, you think, would I have said the same thing 3 years ago? Yeah.
I was thinking more along the lines of, because a lot of people we've spoken to, when you're living in such a stripped down way of life, you become less materialistic to some degree, and you have a kind of newfound appreciation of living with very minimal belongings. Things like that, really, that kind of changed your outlook on, or kind of affected your life once you returned back to civilization. Now, do you think you're less materialistic now, or do you think you're the same as you were before you left?
I'm definitely less materialistic. I don't care for a big TV or the latest sofa or something like that. In fact, I've still got cushions in my flat. I've just renovated. Got to go shopping for something. But no, I'm hugely less materialistic. Probably the only, it's not, it wouldn't be the gathering of possessions that I like. It's the gathering of kit that normally enables me to go on a different type of adventure. So a lot of my possessions revolve around gear, like the stuff, the motorcycle armour I wear, or the boots, or the camera that I like to take along, things like that.
Those items are generally essentials, though, which enable you to partake in something. So, but I don't know. I don't know. I'm just kind of fishing really, because I find it interesting when people undertake long trips, that potentially there is the potential that it can completely change their outlook on life. And I can be very cynical about it, because I know a lot of people who go to Thailand for a month, and then they come back wearing Thai fishing pants, and then they eat a curry with their hands, and they've got a newfound spirituality and stuff like that. So I am really quite cynical about it. But certainly there's a common thread amongst overlanders who've taken a long trip, that a lot of them have said that they're a lot happier after they've returned, because they don't have a lot of the time they've sold everything they own to fund the trip, but that there's that certain liberation and freedom in not owning anything.
Hugely,
you can just kind of up and leave anytime you want, and certainly travelling the way we travel, you certainly have that nomadic kind of sense and lifestyle, and it's something that I can really associate with now.
I totally understand, and I do agree with it, and I do find myself, before, when I would lose something or something would break, it would really quite irritate me. I'd get quite cranky over it. And now I just sort of look at it and go, yeah, things don't last forever. I got my enjoyment out of said item while it worked, or, and if I really need it or miss it, then I need to find a replacement. If it was just a nicety, well, yeah, leave it. I won't bother. Travel lighter.
Yeah. And I think you have a greater appreciation of the quality of things as well. Like if because when you travel in this way, every item you have with you is an essential item. It was raised in a conversation I had with another overlander, Paul Crittenden, and he said he had the same kind of appreciation of quality, because he said he didn't mind spending money on a quality item if he knew it was well built and was going to last him. So he had this kind of appreciation, and certainly the way we travel, you put things, stuff is used daily. So has that kind of influenced your life now? Do you, or have you always been a bit of a gadget freak and liked, nice?
I'm always a bit of a gadget freak, and I've always been quite considered in my choice of gadgets as well. I'm not the first one to adopt the new shiny toy. I'll rather sit on the fence and see how the new shiny toy gets on for a year, and then get a few reviews, and then make my mind up about which of the 5 shiny toys on the market that do a similar thing is the better one or might last a bit longer. And then, as you said, I then might actually go buy one of the more expensive end of the range, simply because it's got the good reviews, it lasts, it's proved its worth in tough conditions or something like that, rather than buying the cheap version just simply because, okay, it'll do its job for a couple of weeks and then keel over and die.
Yeah.
So I can totally appreciate what we're talking about in quality of the equipment you buy, not feigning away from the expense as long as it does its job and it's a value for money thing. For instance, sand plates. Lots of people like the sand tracks and this, that, and the other, and the max tracks.
Yeah.
And they do a job. They get you out of trouble, but they often get chewed up, rightly or wrongly, in the rescue as well. And I'll leave the merits to whether they're suitable for their task or whether it's people just using them wrongly for another discussion. But when I was looking at them, I thought, well, okay, they're 2/3 the price of the aluminium ones, so they're cheaper and they're lighter, and of course they're plastics, so they don't rot or rust or corrode. And you think, okay, they've got some pluses to it. But if they don't actually last through multiple recoveries, I don't want to have to be replacing them or buying new ones in the middle of my trip when finances are tough, shipping them to me is a pain in the arse, or even I might be in the middle of a recovery and one snaps or chews up and dies.
You need to know you can rely on it.
Exactly. So I ended up buying the more expensive, but in some ways simpler, less Gucci, bog standard, tried and tested aluminium ones, and they've been around the world and they've been used and abused, and they're still out there on the Land Rover today.
And as far as you mentioned before that you had a bit of an electronics background, as far as gadgets go, what did you take with you? Did you laptop, I presume, and what else?
Yeah, I've always had a laptop. One for obviously communication and then managing the photos and everything. Then my other next serious gadget would be cameras, really. Nowadays I carry a range of cameras, quite to my photography geekiness. And in the last legs of Australia and South Asia, I even upgraded to a full SLR, which again, most listeners will probably be aware are not cheap toys, and do take up a lot of space and weight. But I felt the quality and the longevity and the standard of images that you get out of it as well was worth all the other cons. So.
Yeah. And as far as documenting your trip, did you obviously photographed it, but were you making films or writing a diary, or did you keep a blog?
I've done a mixture of things over the years. When I went to Africa, I started writing a diary, but after a number of months fell behind and lost the spirit for it, really, because it was more written in the style of a ship's log rather than an actual expressive, emotional style thing. Yeah. And so I fell back on just telling the more unique stories or the exciting stories in it, in writing up articles or things and then posting those. I found that I could get more excited about writing those up and more expressive in that process. Then with the photography, I did actually find a hindrance in just still photography for showing the dynamicism of actually driving off-road and the noise and the strain and the actual steepness of climbs and everything. So
yeah, I can totally relate to that. You end up in situations where you're just like, oh, this is just insane. Then you take a photograph of it, and then you look at the photograph, and it doesn't look half as bad as in the photograph as in reality. Yeah, exactly. So I can totally relate to that.
So that led me towards just starting to film with the stills camera I had. So of course it's quite low quality.
Yeah.
And then over that time, I got better cameras. We got a couple of GoPros, and then actually started making little short videos of exciting scenes from my travel. So again, I didn't do a whole trip to trip or even segment to segment, start to finish video. I would just film, say, interesting river crossings or tough hill climbs or interesting trails that I went on that had stunning views. And like the Southwest Circuit of Bolivia, I'd done a short video for, because it was just such a wondrous place that I felt I had to tell its story better than just in stills on its own. And so yeah, that led me towards video, but I'm still in that stage of just doing short and sweet videos on particular subjects or aspects of where I am at the time, rather than a whole, big documentary or explanation of a whole continent or anything like that. So. Yeah,
and then as you've been travelling as well, just for a bit of drama, as I'm aware we're approaching nearly an hour. Any horror stories? Because actually, I think this is going to be our 5th or 6th podcast now, and we haven't actually had any real horror stories. So have you got any, or just any interesting story where you found yourself in a really odd predicament because you've been an overlander?
I've got a few funny stories for the odd predicament ones, but the biggest, I'll say, horror story I can ever recall is actually being hunted down with guns at night in the jungles of Nigeria.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was the evening. You sat there hiding in your Land Rover, camouflaged up, quite literally fearful for my life, going, "Why the hell did I leave on this trip? What part of me thought this was a good idea right now?"
Okay. And how did you end up in that situation? And who was hunting?
It was the customs and police from the border post I just crossed into, and to avoid the usual troubles of carjacking or kidnapping in Lagos and through the river delta of Nigeria. I'd purposely driven, I think, about 300 miles inland into Benin and gone across a little quiet border post, middle of the Nigerian border. And the idea was to stay in the north, in the actual Arab side, which, because of the Shia law, was actually more lawful up there than it was in the lawless Christian south. And then only drop down to Calabar at the last moment, pick up my Cameroon visa and scoot on into Cameroon. And it was in crossing that border post the facts that were happening around me remind me of a story that another overlander had told me, which is how all the police, customs and immigration, everything, all nicey, but very slow, typical African time. And then they delay you so that when you leave the border post, it's dusk. And they know that overlanders don't generally drive at night, so they won't go far and they'll set camp. And they'll be just down the road and an easy target to come rob. Because they've inspected your vehicle, they've generally seen a lot of the shiny toys that you have on board and have got, in their mind what they'd like to relieve you of. And so as soon as I rolled out of this checkpoint thing and I'd seen everything, all the pieces line up in this thing, I'm thinking, swines, this is what they're up to. And then as I rolled into the town just beyond the border post, everybody was looking at me in the car and just felt like I was a mobile shopping service on wheels. And they were like looking at the tyres going, oh yeah, I'll have that. And oh, that's a nice winch up front. And oh yeah, I like the look of that roof rack. And everybody was literally just pulling the car to bits with their eyes. And it was like, I need to get the hell out of here. And I drove 100 mile at night on jungle tracks because there was only one route out of this place. So I couldn't sort of lose them in twists and turns or just them not knowing which way I went. So I just had to put distance between me and that town. And then I think I finished driving about midnight, something like that. And still worried they might come look for me or find me, I backed the car into the jungle and hacked down loads of undergrowth and put it all over the car and took it to a real serious level. I took dark coloured and black t-shirts out and hung them over the headlights to stop the reflectors reflecting torchlight. I put my bed sheet over my window screen to stop that reflecting light, and then camouflaged everything else with big leafy banana leaves and whatever else I could grab my hands on. So the whole thing was a mobile bush by the time I finished.
Yeah.
And in the dark it helped a bit as well. And so I just slept in the back. I didn't dare sleep in the roof tent that night with the keys in the ignition. And sure enough, about 2 o'clock in the morning, I hear a vehicle coming down the track. And as you're well aware, in these countries, people don't drive at night unless it's something really serious, someone ill or something like that. And so I peered out through the little gap in the window screen I'd left myself. And sure enough, I saw the ute from the border post with 2 guys in the back with AKs and searchlights, and they were scanning the bushes either side as the other 2 in the car were driving along. And my heart was in my mouth, heart then exploding out your chest, and you daren't breathe. And thankfully the camouflage worked, and they didn't see me, and they kept driving. And it wasn't until the following morning did I come across them again, now in a crowded town, drinking tea at the local thing where they couldn't touch me. So.
Oh, very good. I bet you were feeling mildly smug at that point.
Yes, I did.
Still probably a little bit wary, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't hang around. I gave them a smiling wave and a good, hi boys, how you doing? And then quickly planted it on the accelerator and shot off down the road.
Very good. Maybe we should have got into these stories earlier. I think maybe for the next podcast, the next person I interview, I'll just dive straight in with tell me your worst horror story, I think.
Hopefully no one has any really nasty ones like that.
Yeah. But it is something that always gets raised. It's like and a lot of the times I've been thinking about the themes for the podcast, and I've kind of tried to think back all the questions that people would ask us, and they're typical questions that overlanders get asked. I think, aren't you ever scared, or you've been to this country, that isn't it dangerous? And these are a lot of questions that get asked, and typically they're not. These countries aren't dangerous. So Well, most of them.
Yeah, but you obviously choose your routes carefully, don't you? So when I was
Yeah.
coming back from Southeast Asia, I stayed away from the southern Turkish border with Iraq and Syria.
Yeah.
And, of course, just saved a safe distance inland. And you wouldn't believe, in the lovely experience I had across Turkey, you wouldn't think that there was another part of the country virtually in civil war with the Kurds and the Turks, and bombing raids and tanks lined up down the border.
Yeah.
You would have no idea.
Well, again, it's an awareness, and I think that's something that I'll kind of reiterate to all overlanders, if anyone's listening, that just having an awareness of your surroundings is often enough to keep you safe, and whether that be from people operating scams, small scale scams, to potential civil war kicking off. I think it's always important just to be hyper aware of your surroundings, just to stay safe. I could talk for hours and hours and listen to stories. We're still not sure if an hour is the correct format for this podcast, because I listen to a lot of podcasts and quite often I can happily sit for an hour and a half, 2 hours, 2.5 hours listening to one podcast. So I'm contemplating upping the length of the podcasts. But
I think maybe keep them an hour or under an hour, simply because people have busy lives these days, and they might be able to fit the hour into their daily commute, listening to it on a car radio or something like that. And then won't be too boring listening to the same person or people. But then we can always do another one another time. So
that's
if you want a particular theme or something else, or want to talk about a particular continent, or the horror stories or the funny stories of silly situations you got yourself in, and you just end up feeling a bit of a wally because of some cultural misunderstanding or something like that. Or, I'm sure we can throw some other ones out there.
That certainly happens. Maybe I'll do. I could record a couple of specials. Anyway,
yeah, exactly.
You mentioned before you made some short films. Do you have a YouTube channel?
I do indeed. You can easily find it. It's under my name, David Priddis. We've also got a Flickr page if you want to have a look at some of the more high quality photos that I feel I would like to share. And then at the moment, my Facebook page is South Asia Overland at the moment, but I need to come up with a more global title now that I've completed all the chapters. That will be changing soon, so go find it quick.
Okay, well, what we can do is on the website, theoverlandingpodcast.com, we'll put all the links you want, so that anyone listening can go head over there and find all your links. So we'll make sure they're in there as well. Okay, David, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us.
No problem. Always happy to talk about overlanding.
Yeah, hopefully it's been educational, insightful, and that the listeners have got something useful out of it. Anyway, perfect. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Great talking to you.
Okay, thanks for listening. Each episode is completely different, which I guess is reflective of the journeys people take. If you enjoyed this episode, please go back through previous episodes on our website and give them a listen also. Our website, theoverlandingpodcast.com, operates a colour-coded system which makes it easy for you to find the episodes you're interested in. If you only want to listen to episodes with cyclists, click on the blue squares. 4x4s and cars are orange, motorbikes are green, and large trucks and camper vans are pink. You'll also find supporting information, photos and links about each episode on our website. So that's the overlandingpodcast.com. The show is also available on iTunes and Stitcher, where you can subscribe and review. Just search the Overlanding Podcast and you'll find us. We'd love to engage with our listeners, so please find us on Facebook /The Overlanding Podcast and on Twitter @Overland Podcast. You can help support the show just by listening and telling others about it. If you like what you've heard, please share it with your friends and help us spread the word. If you're an overlander yourself and have an interesting story, we'd love to hear from you. We'd especially like to hear from female overlanders and families. You can email us at aroundtheworldin800days@mail.com with the subject heading podcast interview. Okay, until next week, remember the world is your playground.